Well, good evening. It's good to have those of you who are here or who will be here to join us this evening, going over C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. This evening, I will be spending some time uh, doing a general introduction of who Lewis is and what he's done. I think it's just really important that people have a greater understanding of what an absolute giant he was and the kind of contributions that he's made to the world, let alone the Christian world, with his thinking. And I would have to say that in many respects, of of all the people that of all the Christians and the Christian scholars, he is both, in many respects, among the most profound, and on one hand, and yet the most accessible to the average layperson, the average Christian as well, which is good for me because I'm not a scholar, although I'm very much an appreciator of who Lewis is. And so I want to, excuse me, just go over some of the general structures of how we will do things for the next couple of months each Sunday evening as we do this C.S. Lewis study. So the first thing I want to say, and I just really need to emphasize this, is that while it's really beneficial to read the book, for this particular podcast, I don't think you have to read the book to really benefit from what we will be covering. And and so if you find the book to be too inaccessible in some respects, still tune in. Don't become discouraged because um, it's still beneficial to hear what we will be talking about, and I will try very hard to make what we talk about meaningful and relevant and accessible to everybody that is listening to what we have to say. This is the copy that I will be using right here. There is another copy that's yellow, and it matches this as well. So if you can, it's helpful to have a similar copy so that when I say, please turn to page, 23, look at paragraph 2, then we're all on the same page and we can read the same thing. But even if you don't have that, it's still valuable to have your book. You can catch up fairly quickly, and not only that, but you can benefit just by hearing what the book has to say. So I just want to mention that to you as well. If you can, it's just really helpful for me and for everybody else. There's a comment line associated with YouTube, and if you can just say hello and maybe who you are, um, that would be encouraging to me and helpful to me as well as who are here. And also, I just want to say in that comment line that you can ask a question, and if I can catch it after you've sent it, then I can address it in real time. If not, I can read it later and then be able to come back and say, this person asked this question. And believe me when I say there are no dumb questions. Okay, there's no all questions are valid questions in this world that we're about to go into, and so I just really want to encourage you in that way. Okay. Um, so we were probably going to go chapter by chapter. There may be some chapters that I omit depending on the discussion and the relevancy. So don't be surprised, but I'll make sure I let you know that ahead of time. Um, you can also text or email me if you like about any questions that you might have. Feel free to do that. One of the things that I want to say about this particular book, Mere Christianity, is that many people see this as primarily an apologetic book, a book where Lewis makes the argument, defends the faith. And overall, the argument that he makes here is what you would call a moral argument for the existence of God and the defense of the Christian faith. there are other elements of apologetics associated with that, but I would say that is the primary, that is probably the primary apologetic that most people would use for mere Christianity in terms of describing that. Tonight, I'm going to be, as I said, going over sort of the background of Lewis, because those of you who attend church, that I reference him a lot. And I have to tell you personally that for the whole, almost the entire whole of my Christian life, that Lewis has been a literary mentor for me. That maybe other than the Bible, more than any other author I've read, I would say that that he's influenced my thinking in the most. Not in a systematic sort of way, because Lewis is not a systematic theologian, and not merely when it comes to apologetics, because I don't think that you could read any Lewis for any length of time without delving into the world of spiritual formation, discipleship, those kinds of things. I mean, I think that he is he's just as relevant in that way, in the spiritual formation way, as any other way, because he has a way of looking deeply into the heart of the Christian, and to speak in very powerful ways. And that is particularly true with two books that I've used in the past and have done podcasts here in the past, the Screw Tape Letters and The Great Divorce. So, excuse me. So, those books are intensely spiritual formation kinds of books, intensely, and really, really helpful and good for us to read as well. So, what I'm going to be doing from this point on is probably reading certain sections from other texts that help to describe who this giant is. And he is a giant. So, understand that when we read him, and when we're referencing, things that he's said, that you're really sitting at the feet of a master. And I hope that you can appreciate that, and really be excited about it. So there is a book written by a guy named David C. Downing. Excuse me, I just have a frog this evening in my throat. Entitled "The Most Reluctant Convert." Lewis was born in 1898. And so he would have been born during the height of what we would call modernity. So, in other words, modernity followed, in many respects, what was called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment saw the rise of reason and logic as the predominant way, the lens through which everybody interpreted reality. And so Lewis was born in the middle of that. And interestingly enough, that idea of modernity really coalesced itself in Nazi Germany through all kinds of things that they did. And so Lewis was, in many respects, deeply suspicious of modernity. And as a result of that, many people read C.S. Lewis as a prophet of sorts about what the negative effects would be later on, generations later, of that particular project. And so, and we're seeing that in real time now in a world called post-modernity. And Lewis, it seems as if when you read certain things that he said, that he saw it. I mean, he saw what we are experiencing today in our lives, that he could see it in his day, in his time, particularly in the 1940s and early 50s, at the height of his literary influence in the world in which we live. So I'm just going to read some sections here, and then what I'm going to do is, in the end, is read for you some of my most favorite, um, among some of my most favorite quotes. He's incredibly quotable, and so hopefully we can, get to that. I'm probably going to go about 45 minutes, maybe 50 minutes tonight. So hopefully we can get to that. So Downing says both Lewis and his biographers have recounted his childhood in Northern Ireland, his years in English boarding schools, and his eventual adoption of Oxford as the place where he would live the rest of his life. And, uh, Lewis's experience in boarding schools back then, particularly at night, could be hell on earth for kids. Because in many boarding schools, basically, they just, from grade school on up through high school, they just shoved them all into one big room and locked the door for the night. And so whatever happened in those rooms, and they could be awful. But that was part of Lewis's experience. This narrative seeks to trace more closely Lewis's inward pilgrimage towards his faith, how his spiritual journey was shaped by the untimely death of his mother and a lasting estrangement from his father. So his father was always this distant figure that Lewis never really connected with. His mother was the daughter of a pastor, and so there was that influence in his life early on. By the relentless rationalism hammered into him by an influential mentor. So you mentioned that I talked about how he lived during the height of modernity. So this, in a very personal way, this person influenced him with a relentless imposition of rationalism on him. And by his early interest, get this, by his early interest in the occult and the paranormal. So the occult in that day was very, very popular. There were many, many people of polite society who regularly practiced used Ouija boards and practiced the occult and spiritualism and those kinds of things. And so Lewis, at an early age, was kind of swept up into that. So many people don't know that about him, but uh, before he came to faith in Christ, that was a prominent part of his life early on, not so much later as he became an adult. So as a part of this tracing, and by his early interest in the occult and the paranormal, and by the surreal violence of trench warfare in France during World War II. So Lewis fought in World War I, and he went into World War I, the Great War in France, in, I want to say, 1917, where he was injured and still recovering from that injury in 1918. And knowing what I know about Lewis, and I don't know nearly enough, but what I do know, it just makes me gasp that this kind of a great mind, this intellect, this person who would be one of the most influential people in the 20th century in terms of Christendom, almost died in World War I, and the world would have been profoundly impoverished had he died. So counterposed to these influences was Lewis's ongoing quest for something he called joy. And if you read a lot of Lewis's works, there's always this theme that seems to be a part of it that we call joy. And many times, those of you who have been a part of our church service know that I've often said that the Christian should lead their lives with joy. The joy ought to be a regular part about how we are identified initially. Just real, true, authentic joy. And Lewis was a person who pursued that. I think he found it to be elusive early on in life, and it was something that he acquired a deep and abiding appetite for later on in life. probably something that we should seek, that it should be a regular part of our lives as well. So, after first seeking joy in false guises of the erotic and the occult, Lewis increasingly began to sense a certain radiant quality in righteousness, which he discovered first in the works of George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton. Now, George MacDonald was a person that Lewis read and also a person that Lewis knew when he began to teach at Oxford. G.K. Chesterton was a very influential writer and apologist around the same time who preceded Lewis, a formidable debater on behalf of the Christian faith. And I've read a couple of his books, and really, really well worth writing. Very winsome. Uh, and I can see in Lewis's writings, I can see the Chesterton influence as well. Maybe that would be a book that we might want to think about in the future as well, one of those two books. Then in the circle of Christian scholars at Oxford, including most notably J.R.R. Tolkien. So Tolkien was a contemporary, and so any of you who know Tolkien know about his Lord of the Rings series, which ostensibly has been one of the most influential book series in the last, say, 20 years, and in terms of film, clearly a highly influential work as well. So Lewis belonged to a group called the Inklings, and they would meet people like Tolkien, as well as some others, scholars, writers, literary people, would meet at the local pub. And as I understand it, Tolkien would bring some of what he wrote. The Lord of the Rings series was written primarily, in many respects, for his children, that he would read to them at night. But he would bring manuscripts to the pub and read them out loud at the pub. And so people like Lewis and others would listen and then offer some suggestions. And so Lewis had some influence in that way in what Tolkien wrote, and in other ways as well. A careful look at Lewis's early years reveals that he did not become an effective defender of the faith, despite the fact that he spent so many years as an unbeliever. Rather, his Christian books are compelling precisely because he spent so many years as an unbeliever. He understood atheism. He felt the force of its arguments in his bones and sinews. He knew the lure of the occult. Indeed, he wrote that if the wrong person had come along in his teenage years, he might have ended up a sorcerer or a lunatic. And he was philosophically trained in idealism, which is a kind of rationalism, the assumption that some unknowable, absolute lies beyond the veil of appearances. He weighed out all these worldviews himself, and in weighing out those worldviews, eventually found them wanting, that they were not significant. So Lewis explored atheism. He explored a whole host of different worldviews, other religious worldviews, and in fact can comment on them fairly well. And yet, as he examined all of them, he found that they were not sufficient. They didn't meet, they didn't get to this inner hunger that he had. And so when this reluctant convert eventually faced up to the meaning of his Christian commitment, he entered into it with his whole heart, mind, and soul. So in many respects, you could say that he counted the cost of what it meant to make a commitment to his Christian faith. He had already had time to discount all of these other manifestations, all these other ideologies. He had a chance to examine them, to live in them, to think about them, and none of them were sufficient. And so when he finally came to faith in Christ, it was because he knew about these other things, and they were not sufficient. They didn't answer the questions that needed to be answered in his heart and mind. Now, there is this other text, and there are a gazillion of these. But this one is a book written by Alistair McGrath, one of the seminal, one of the more profound Christian theologians of the 20th century. Alistair McGrath has written a gazillion books. And so he's written this particular book about C.S. Lewis and his life. And so I just want to take a few excerpts from this as well, because I think that they are helpful in understanding who this person, C.S. Lewis, was and the significant contributions that he's made. And so, again, I'm going to read. There's just so much here that it's hard to distill it in a way that's helpful to you. So it's probably more helpful that I read just certain segments and then let it impact you in whatever way it can. So McGrath says the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte once quipped that the best way of making sense of people is to find out what was happening in the world when they were 20 years old. A few weeks before November 29th, 1918, the day that Lewis turned 20, the Great War finally came to an end. Many felt guilty for surviving while their comrades had fallen. Those who served in trench warfare were permanently marked by the violence and destruction and horrors they experienced. Lewis's 20th year was shaped by his firsthand experience of armed conflict. So here was this budding scholar who served as a soldier in trench warfare. And if you know anything about trench warfare in the Great War, that is World War I, it was just horrific, beyond horrific in terms of the vast death, the suffering, the horror of living in the trench, where it was your feet were in water all of the time. You had all kinds of disease and filth that came from that. You had the mustard gas that was launched over into the trenches by the German soldiers. It was just brutal. And Lewis, at age 20, saw all of that as a soldier. So he arrived in the trenches near Arras in northwestern France on his 19th birthday, and on his 20th was still recuperating from the war wounds he had suffered. If Napoleon was right, Lewis's world of thought and experience would have been irreparably and irreversibly shaped by war, trauma, and loss. We might therefore expect Lewis's inner being to be deeply molded by the impact of conflict and close brushes with death. Yet Lewis himself tells us otherwise. His experience of war was, he informs us, in a way, unimportant. He seems to view his experience at English boarding schools as more unpleasant than the time he spent in the trenches of France. While Lewis served on the battlefields in France in 1917 and 1918, experiencing the horrors of modern warfare, Surprised by Joy, a book that he wrote, fairly popular book, makes only scant reference to it. Lewis clearly believed that his woes during his year at Malvern College were of greater importance than his entire wartime experience, and even then seems to prefer to concentrate his narrative on the books he read and the people he met. The unspeakable suffering and devastation around him had been filtered out. It had, Lewis tells us, been more than adequately written about other people. He had nothing to add to it. His voluminous later writings make little mention of the war. Interestingly, Lewis never regarded the encouragement and the well-wishing of people who had not been off to war very highly, because they had nothing to empathize about. Uh, he knew what he saw and what he experienced, and oftentimes I think saw the shallow encouragement that came from people who had not been to war as something either naive or maybe even offensive. It just wasn't something that he appreciated that much. Some readers will feel that there's a certain sense of imbalance and disproportion here. Why did Lewis spend 3 chapters of Surprised by Joy detailing his relatively minor woes at Malvern College and pay so little attention to the vastly more significant violence, trauma, and horror of the Great War? This sense of imbalance is only reinforced by a reading of Lewis's works as a whole, in which the Great War is largely passed over, or, when mentioned, is treated as something that happened to someone else. It is as if Lewis was seeking to distance or disassociate himself from his memories of conflict. And why? The simplest explanation is also the most plausible. Lewis could not bear to remember the trauma of his wartime experiences, whose irrationality called into question whether there was any meaning in the universe at large or in Lewis's personal existence particular. So we have that with what his experience was in the war. And I mentioned the war because most people don't know that he had that experience. And I think that experience shaped him significantly. In particular, you would see that in the Screwtape Letters, where he writes some about war in general and how Screwtape, that is the senior demon, could mentor a junior demon in the use of war to woo a person away from their faith. So that would be the one example that I know that would have that Lewis would have cited, although he didn't cite it much, but he did cite it and used it as an example and said, in fact, there was one example here, and I think I might have lost it in my referencing here, where he would not be prone to praying then. So let me just go to this section here and read this, because I think this is just so relevant, and it will help to expose you to this person who is, I think, truly remarkable. So who is C.S. Lewis, 1898 to 1963? For many, probably most, Lewis is the creator of the fabulous world of Narnia, the author of some of the best known and most discussed children's books of the 20th century, which continue to attract enthusiastic readers and sell in the millions. 50 years after his death, Lewis remains one of the most influential, popular writers of our age. Lewis remains one, alongside his equally famous Oxford colleague and friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings. Lewis is widely seen as a literary and cultural landmark. The worlds of literature and cinema have been deeply shaped by both of these Oxford authors. Again, most people don't think that. They don't see that of him in that regard. Yet without Lewis, The Lord of the Rings might never have been written, says McGrath. Lewis may have created his own bestsellers, but he also was a midwife to Tolkien's masterpiece, The Lord of the Rings, even proposing Tolkien for the 1961 Nobel Prize in Literature on the basis of this epic work. For these reasons alone, the story of C.S. Lewis is worthy of telling. So forget about what he wrote about apologetics and about all this other stuff that he wrote, his influence in the world of cinema, his influence in the world of literature, and his influence in other authors is mammoth. But there's far more to C.S. Lewis than this. As Lewis's long-term friend Owen Barfield once remarked, there really were three C.S. Lewises. Alongside Lewis, the author of best-selling novels, there is the second, less well-known persona, Lewis, the Christian writer and the apologist, concerned to communicate and share his rich vision of the intellectual and imaginative power of the Christian faith, a faith he discovered in the middle of his life and found rationally and spiritually compelling. Much to the annoyance of some, his mere Christianity is now often cited as the most influential religious work of the 20th century. This book right here is often cited as the most influential religious work of the 20th century. So that's what we're going to read. That's what we're going to study. How good it would be to know that we've read what some people refer to, aside from the Bible, as the most influential religious work of the 20th century. This said by McGrath, who's also one of the most influential religious writers in the 20th century. Yet, there is a third aspect to Lewis, perhaps the least familiar to most of his admirers and critics. The distinguished Oxford don and literary critic who packed lecture theaters with his unscripted reflections on English literature, who went on to become the first occupant of the chair of medieval and Renaissance English in the University of Cambridge, few might now read his preface to Paradise Lost. In its day, however, set a new standard through its clarity and insight. And so Lewis wasn't just a Christian writer. Lewis was highly regarded, for his work in literature as well. And so he had a following even among non-believers for his work that he did in literature as a whole. Lewis's profound professional calling was to the groves of the Academy. His election as a Fellow of the British Academy in July 1955 was a public demonstration of his high scholarly repute. Yet some in the academic world regarded his commercial and popular success as being inconsistent with any claim on his part to be a serious scholar. So because he wrote the Screwtape Letters, because he wrote The Great Divorce, because he wrote Mere Christianity, some of his colleagues then thought he's just not really a serious scholar, because serious scholars would not write texts like that. And so Lewis paid a price. He paid a professional price for the work that he did in this kind of Christian literature. So from 1942 onwards, Lewis struggled to maintain his academic credibility in the light of his more popular works, above all, his lighthearted musings on the diabolical world of Screwtape. So I thought that you might find that to be interesting about Lewis himself. So any attempt to deal with Lewis's rise to prominence has to acknowledge his misgivings about assuming a public role. Lewis was indeed a prophet to his own day and age and beyond. Yet it must be said that he was a reluctant prophet. Even his own conversion seemed to take place against his better judgment, and having been converted to Christianity, Lewis spoke out on its themes largely because of the silence or the unintelligibility of those who he believed were better placed than he was to engage religious and theological questions publicly. So Lewis believed that there were other people, better trained, better educated, who could say more profound things about the Christian faith, and yet they were wanting. They were not articulate. They were not accessible. They were unintelligible to many people. And so Lewis wanted to try and make the beauty of the Christian faith more accessible. Lewis also came across as something of an eccentric in the proper sense of the term. Someone who departs from recognized, conventional, or established norms or patterns, or who is displaced from the center of things. Many of Lewis's academic colleagues at Oxford came to regard him as an outsider from about 1940, both on account of his openly Christian views and his unscholarly habit of writing popular books of fiction and apologetics. Lewis famously described his distance from the prevailing academic trends of his day when he referred to himself as a dinosaur in his inaugural lecture at Cambridge University in 1954. This sense of distance from the center is also evident in Lewis's religious life. Although Lewis became a highly influential voice within British Christianity as well as the United States, he operated from its margins rather than from its center, and had no time for the cultivation of relationships with leading figures of the religious establishment. It was perhaps this trait that endeared him to some in the media, anxious to find an authentic religious voice outside the power structures of the mainstream church. So this gives us, I think, even more clear picture of who Lewis was in that regard. Now, on to Mere Christianity. And so there are some things here that I want to read from his preface. And, I got to tell you that when I began to read this preface, I was just washed over again by the beauty of his prose, his writing, his humility, and his ability to just grasp things of great weight and say them in such a simple way that revealed his inner character. I've known, not personally, although some personally, but I've known many great people of faith. I've met some people who are highly regarded and influential within the Christian faith as a writer. But of all the writers that I've ever met who are highly influential, I'm struck by the humility of this particular person, C.S. Lewis. He's a person who always took his work and his calling very seriously, but he never seemed to take himself seriously. And I always appreciated that about him and felt that it was helpful and good for me to model in my own life. So Lewis says here in his preface on page 8, Roman numeral 8, "Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. I had more than one reason for thinking this." So let me just say this again. He says, Lewis, "Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and to defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. I had more than one reason for thinking this. In the first place, the questions which divide Christians from one another often involve points of high theology or even ecclesiastical history, that is, church history, which ought never to be treated except by real experts. I should have been out of my depth in such waters, and more in need of my help myself than able to help others. So he's trying to bypass some of the built-in problems that are associated with deep theology and in church history, things that get in the way. And secondly, he says, I think we must admit that the discussion of these disputed points has no tendency at all to bring the outsider into the Christian fold. So, in whatever way we disagree theologically, or whatever way we disagree about church history or church tradition or whatever, those things never help to bring people who are non-believers into the church. They just don't help. And when we debate or discuss or argue those things publicly, it doesn't bring people in. Rather, it encourages them to stay out. So long as we write and talk about them, we are much more likely to deter him from entering any Christian community. I'm sorry, I really just really muffed that up. So long as we write and talk about them so long as we talk about them, we are much more likely to deter him, that is the non-believer, from entering any Christian communion than to draw him into our own. Our divisions should never be discussed except in the presence of those who believe that there is one God and that Jesus Christ is his only Son. So he was very keen on those kinds of things. Finally, I got the impression that far more talented authors are already engaged in such controversial matters than in the defense of what Baxter calls mere Christianity. That part of the line where I thought I could serve best was also the part that seemed to be the thinnest. So he's saying, look, it seems to me that where I could serve best in terms of what I bring to the table is the part where there's more work to be done, that not enough work has been done. And so he says, and to it, I naturally went. As far as I know, these were my only motives, and I should be very glad if people would not draw fanciful inferences from my silence on certain disputed matters. So Lewis intentionally does not discuss certain things like, should we do infant baptism? Should we do believer baptism? Those kinds he doesn't discuss that because he said there are other people who are more equipped than him. And there's a greater need, he says, to do this apologetic, this defense of the Christian faith, because that's where we are thinnest and we need to do better about that. He says, for I am not writing to expound something I would call, quote, my religion, but to expound mere Christianity, which is what it is, and what it was long before I was born, whether I like it or not. So then he goes on to say, he sort of outlines the book. Now, I think it's helpful for you to know that this book is a composition of radio addresses that he made at the BBC, the British Broadcasting Network. And so during World War II, he would have this hour-long address where he would teach. And those teachings were put together and comprised in this particular book. So they were originally a radio address that have since been put to pen. And so that's what we have here. So I think that is what I want to talk about. And I may go back and, share more from this particular preface because it is helpful. And so next week, we're going to be doing chapter 1, the law of human nature. And it is somewhat philosophical. And so but not. I don't think it's beyond us. I mean, I think that it will be fine to read. So we'll be reading chapter 1. I'm looking here, and chapter 2 is not very long either. So I may get to chapter 2, but I will certainly get to chapter 1 next week. Now, I want to just give you some of my favorite. They aren't all of them, but there are a lot of them. But some of my favorite quotes by Lewis. And so, and then just make a couple of comments, and then we can be done for the evening. But this is kind of like both an apologetic as well as a spiritual formation kind of quote. And a very popular quote, by the way, where he says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, that is the sun, but because by it I see everything else. So, we believe not only that the sun rises and we can see the sun, but we believe that the sun exists because of what we can see because of the sun. And so he is saying, I believe in Christianity not only because I can actually see it, but it's my Christian faith that helps me to see everything else that I could not see were it not for that. So here's another one, and this is a quote that is oftentimes attributed to him, but there's another quote similar to it by a guy named, I believe, Athanasius. I think it was the guy. I think that was the guy. I'm pretty sure that's who the guy was. But Lewis has refined it somewhat. And so he says, the Son of God became a man to enable men to become sons of God. And so if you read in Galatians 5, for example, where Paul declares that we are all sons of God through faith in Christ, this is a very profound statement. The Son of God became a man to enable men to become sons of God. So you have this exchange that takes place, that, Jesus sets aside in Philippians 2, Paul talks about how Jesus set aside some of his godly attributes in order to become a man. And by becoming a man, and through his becoming a man, both God and man, we as men and women become the sons and daughters of God. There's this just wonderful exchange through Christ that happens. Lewis makes this observation, which I think is very helpful too. Human history is the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God, which will make him happy. So, again, another very astute observation. And then let me see if there was one more that I wanted to get to. And I love this quote. And this is just a very powerful quote. And again, this is just one of those apologetic quotes. A man can no more diminish God's glory by refusing to worship him than a lunatic can put out the sun by scribbling the word darkness on the walls of his cell. What an incredibly powerful, stark contrast. A man can no more diminish God's glory by refusing to worship him than a lunatic can put out the sun by scribbling the word darkness on the walls of his cell. This is kind of like a presuppositional statement. I mean, it's just like, doesn't matter what other people say. It doesn't impact the existence of God or who God is or anything. It doesn't affect any of that. It's still true. So in any case, those are some of, I got to give you this to him. God cannot give us happiness and peace apart from himself because it is not there. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as true happiness and peace apart from God. So, and then finally, another very popular and I love this one too. Joy is the serious business of heaven. And so we get this theme of joy again that Lewis pursues in so many of his works. So for next week, if you would, read chapters 1 and 2, and we will use those for our discussion. Please, if you are on here and haven't indicated, please write it on the line there that you were here. Just say hello so that I know who you were, and it will help me when I see you at church or some other place to um, identify you and ask you about this podcast and see what you think. I hope you didn't mind this introduction. I hope that this helped you to see better the person that we will be reading and why he's important to read. So and we'll look forward to, and I I honestly think you'll be kind of rocked by chapters 1 and 2. I really do. I mean, he starts off with just an incredibly articulate argument about the moral law that's just very powerful. So I'll look forward to sharing that with you next week. So please say hello in this little comment line if you would, and I will see you next week. And thank you for joining me, and thank you to those who will be joining me. Share this podcast with others. Just a reminder, we also have a podcast on the Screw Tape Letters and on the Great Divorce, both of which I thought went very well, and just have some great content, not just because I'm doing it, but because of the text itself and other things that we were able to attach to it that just made it really good. So we'd like this podcast to get out as much as possible. Okay. All right. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.